Imagine for a moment that you are approaching a building. This building has Corinthian columns rising 15 meters into the sky. Each of these columns is topped by winding, ornate acanthus leaves. Unusually, you approach the entrance on a long side of this rectangular building. You see that the strong desert sun has turned the formerly white limestone into a rich golden yellow color. To your right and to your left, there's an altar. You look closely and you see some carved artwork. It's Arab in origin, but Greco-Roman and Egyptian as well in influence. Standing in front of this temple in 1902, Gertrude Bell, a renowned traveler and poetry translator, said that with the exception of Petra, this was the most beautiful place she had ever been. This, as she had photographed it in 1902, is the Temple of Bel in Palmyra, Syria. It stood since 32 AD. If you want to visit it, I'm afraid that's no longer possible. It was razed to the ground in August 2015 by ISIS. I have long wanted to visit, long before I became a historian, long before I took an art history course which introduced me to another way to tell time. In fact, my fascination with historical monuments and historical architecture goes back far longer than that. I still recall being a child, being glued to the television, watching documentary films that looked at Egyptian pyramids that still held secrets, or Sumerian tombs that were still sealed shut, and the technologies that we were developing to gather more and more insights about how people lived in the past. To me, the idea that these ancient monuments, that these artifacts continued to exist, that they were out there for us to see, was nothing short of a miracle, a way, in fact, to time travel. During times of upheaval, during times of revolution, particular groups have made a point, a sometimes protracted point, of deliberately destroying these particular cultural artifacts and these particular historical monuments. So I'm not speaking of collateral damage in this case. I'm speaking of the systemic, deliberate, and targeted destruction of these particular artifacts. In this kind of destruction, what we're really seeing is the breaking of that tactile experiential link that we can have with the past, our ability to see it, to come close to it, to potentially touch it, and for some of us, to interpret it. This kind of destruction, I believe, has a parallel destruction, which is more insidious, the destruction of cultural memory, and thereby of cultural identity. Why does this matter? It matters because when these historical objects are destroyed, it makes it harder to assess and reassess history. It makes it harder for us to be able to understand the place of these monuments, for us to experience them directly. What can we do about this? I think in the first instance, it's really important for us to develop a stronger case for why we should preserve these monuments. I think intuitively, we think we like to have these objects around. To me, this is fundamental. We do, don't we? We intuitively think it would be nice to keep these objects around. It would be nice to have museums. But I think that we should make a case, a stronger case, for defending and preserving these historical monuments. And we should be very aware at attempts at destroying things in parallel to the destruction of buildings themselves. Because ultimately what's being destroyed, it's not just buildings, it's collective memory, it's a multiplicity of approaches, it's the right of access to objects and the identities that it unlocks, that it validates, and that it explains. In August of 1992, during the siege of Sarajevo, the National Library was bombed. This library had held rare manuscripts, rare volumes that detailed the flourishing of a multicultural life of the region under the Ottoman and Austro-Hungarian empires. Foreign journalists who were watching this destruction happen in front of them had reported that the library's main reading room had these thin Moorish columns which could not take the intense heat and exploded, and that sections of the roof fell through the ceiling. 3 months prior to this bombing, Sarajevo's Oriental Institute, which held the country's largest collection of Islamic and Ottoman texts, likewise had been targeted for destruction. In both of these instances, and in several more across Bosnia around this time, the targeting was deliberate. The buildings on either side were untouched. So in this destruction of archives, of libraries, of cultural institutions, and therefore of these documents, it seemed to be about breaking that material link that we have, that experiential link of looking at documents, of looking at books, of looking at works of art that can show a future generation that, in fact, people of different ethnic backgrounds, people of different religious traditions had once shared a common ancestry in this particular region. People had volunteered, along with the librarians, to form a human chain while the library was burning to get some of these manuscripts to safety. When one of the volunteers was asked why he was risking his life, he said, pointing to the library, "Our heritage, our national identity is there." When the Chief Fire Brigade was asked why he was risking his life, he said, "Because I was born here, and now they are burning a part of me." In 2002, in a report to UNESCO, the library director took pains to explain that the reconstruction of this building was at the same time the reconstruction of memory. From April of 2012 to September of 2013, members of Ansar Dine destroyed most of Mali's mausoleums and shrines. In a landmark ruling, the International Criminal Court found former civil servant al-Mahdi guilty of war crimes in a case that was solely focused on cultural destruction. In recorded videos, al-Mahdi had said, "We must remove from the landscape everything which does not belong." But to Ansar Dine members, it was not merely the ancient mausoleums and shrines which did not belong, which they found idolatrous. It was the activities that took place alongside them. For prior to their destruction, these sites had been used by members of the community for a number of diverse religious and diverse cultural ceremonies. So, for instance, they held music festivals there, they held oral literature festivals, but they were also the sites of community conflict resolution and community building. These shrines were built in the 15th and 16th century, when Timbuktu was, in fact, the center of this particular region. It was the center economically, it was the center intellectually, and it was the center spiritually. And current-day Mali's diversity, comes from this culmination of years of interweaving of different groups in that area. In August 2015, ISIS completed the destruction of the Temple of Bel, which they had started 2 years prior. Until its destruction, it was one of the most complete structures to have survived from this time. The temple was consecrated in 32 AD, and it was along a major trade route. And as a result of this, the area grew prosperous, and it was also heavily influenced by the cultures east and west of it. In the architectural heritage in the Temple of Bel, we have evidence of cultures coming together creatively. Through the passage of time, with the rise of Christianity, the temple became converted to a Byzantine church, and then with the coming of Islam, it became a mosque. In the early 1900s, the site of ancient Palmyra had long been in ruins, but in fact, it was still being used. It was still being inhabited in parts. So the surrounding areas were used as shelter by nomads and herders, and the temple itself had a little thriving village in it, a microcosm, a tribute, in fact, to the different groups that had traded together, that had lived together harmoniously for large periods of time prior. A number of social psychologists now argue that identities are not composed of narratives and stories, but in fact, identities are narratives and stories. So where do these stories come from? How do we believe the things we believe about ourselves and our past? So this is a complicated question, but at least part of the answer is found in first-hand experiences. So educational psychologists will tell you that first-hand experience is better than second because that experiential learning can fundamentally shift your mindset. So, what happens then in the absence of these first-hand experiences, or the absence of what historians call primary sources, the base material for which we understand and interpret history? We all know that there's a distance between what we are told and what we believe. But in fact, you can shorten this distance. You can even overcome this distance with well-crafted, well-constructed, even if not necessarily always well-meaning narratives. Researchers at the University of Waterloo found that narratives were particularly effective at overcoming strong resistance to persuasion. And they had a couple of reasons that they found for that. One of these reasons was that people don't expect narratives to shift their beliefs. They don't expect narratives to challenge the things that they believe and their attitudes. And so therefore, their resistance to what a narrative brought to them was lower. Secondly, narratives inspired a kind of close attention to detail in listening for how the story proceeds that's not inspired by, say, rhetoric or direct targeted messages, which we tend to ignore if it doesn't line up with our previously held attitudes or our previous experiences. But the researchers concluded that these narratives were particularly good at conveying under the radar certain messages. So, for instance, you can think of any number of advertising and marketing campaigns now that use a social media story to envelop you. So, further to this, psychologists Alice Eagley and Shelley Chagan also demonstrated that the timing and the delivery of a message is particularly crucial to how we accept it and to whether or not we believe it. They discovered that when the timing and the delivery of a message is forced, that you're more likely to be persuaded by it than if you have a message which you're exposed to in a self-paced way. That is to say, if you have time to think about the message, if you have time to reflect on it and have that space for critical thinking in relation to what you're actually listening to or being exposed to. So what is the purpose of history in light of all of this? A rich and complex history is a bulwark and a threat to simple, one-dimensional, particularly motivated, but potentially nevertheless convincing narratives about the past. A few years ago, I was at a history conference, and I heard historian and journalist Timothy Garden Ash make the case that historians and non-historians alike ought to defend the frontier of facts. Despite the inherent complexity and subjectivity of studying identity and memory, we must still be clear about what the base facts, the primary sources, the raw material on which we build these stories and narratives are. It seems to me it's precisely because of this complex interweaving of memory, of identity, of history, of self-identification, that we must defend the right of the past to speak to us and to future generations directly. Our resultant interpretations may not always be equally valid or equally compelling, but we must guard against the erasure of these objects, when in doing so, that erasure might attempt to limit us to one or a few interpretations. So in defending historical objects, we are allowing a multiplicity of interpretations, a multiplicity of meanings, even ones that we don't like or that we don't agree with, to flourish in ensuring that the objects of inquiry themselves remain. Thank you.